Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. It's been a while since I've done one of these videos. What can I say? Life has interfered. I've just moved from Newcastle to London, and I'm sure, as you know, you have to do a lot of stuff when you move. My girlfriend is joining me from her flat next weekend, so there's been a lot of logistics to sort out. And so that's it. I have been writing as well, and I'll put up some stuff on my blog. I'll basically separate this discussion today into a little introduction in terms of what I've been doing on the blog, finance related. The piece I'm putting out tonight. I'm recording this the 20th of September, and I think the post is scheduled to go out tonight. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll get into what's going on with the virus, which I think is really sort of one of the main sort of shifts at the moment in terms of both where we are and with the economy, but also actually where we are in terms of the general conversation we're having with each other, at least especially in Europe. And then I'll get into some of the stuff that's going on, and mainly it's very US centric because it has to do with the Black Lives Matter and the sort of whole the wokeism mainstream discussion, which tends to be degenerative, I think, and then where we can go to have an uplifting discussion instead, and what kind of sources we can look for to kind of detox our mind a little bit from that. Hopefully I can contribute to that in my own capacity as well, but I think that to the extent I actually can do some good with these videos, I can kind of point you towards discussions and debates and people who are having good discussions instead of bad and degenerative discussions. And if we can do that together, maybe we can pull ourselves out of the hole that we are increasingly digging ourselves into. Anyway, on the blog, the post I'm going to put out tonight is very geeky. It follows on from the post or the essay, if you will, that I did just before I kind of went on hiatus to finish my move, which is a piece which basically argues that all investors are effectively short volatility. And what I mean about that is that what works today, which effectively is the 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, that's effectively now an embedded and levered short volatility position. And the reason it is so is that normally such a portfolio would have a tendency to offer a little bit of a protection against downside, because bonds and stocks are supposed to move, supposed to be uncorrelated. But at the moment we are now entering a regime, we have been in a regime, and we're kind of perpetuating a regime where what is good for bonds is also good for stocks, and vice versa, right? So that obviously generates the very, very real fear among investors that what happens if this regime changes? Does that mean that everything kind of just breaks down and nothing works, and no matter what you've done, you're just going to lose, just suffer very, very big drawdown? Now, just to be clear, these kinds of warnings have been with us for like 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 years, right? That's why we talk about perma bears. But I think still it's important to at least consider where there could be a regime change, and whether we can position ourselves as investors to take advantage of that regime change, or maybe even if you take a step back, to maybe allow us to become more resilient. So in order to answer that sort of question, in order to provide an example of this, what I do in my blog post is I basically try to use the oldest tool in the book, modern portfolio theory. Specifically, I do some simulations on the tangent efficient frontier portfolio versus the minimum variance portfolio, and actually I think the results are quite interesting. Basically, what I show, I think, with some very, very simple tools is that absolutely the 60-40 portfolio, especially a 60-40 portfolio where you are supposed to be invested in US growth stocks and bonds, is a portfolio that just wins. It was good yesterday, it's good today, and if you look at the model, it's going to be good tomorrow. And actually it's an optimal model which is extremely simple to come up with even a simple tool, which again goes to show why investors basically are flocking into that type of strategy, because it works and it works very, very, very well. In other words, to come up with an efficient frontier portfolio that is 60% invested in US growth stocks, just to take that as an example, and 40% long-term government bonds in the US is extremely simple. You only have to set up a very, very simple model, and that then becomes the optimal model portfolio allocation to go for. What happens, however, if you use the minimum variance portfolio is something very, very profound and interesting. A portfolio like that is overweight value stocks. Yes, that's what you heard that right. Overweight value stocks alongside bonds. And the key here is, of course, that if bonds and growth stocks are interchangeable, why would you hold both? Why wouldn't you try to hold something apart from that might then offer you a little bit of relative protection? And that's kind of like the kind of strategy and message that I'm trying to convey with this message. Anyway, it's quite geeky. You need to be interested in this type of portfolio allocation stuff. And I've put up my Excel sheet as well, so you can run the models, you can run some simulations yourself. Again, this is not for everyone, but I've been brewing on this piece for a while, and it's nice to get it out. And if you have any questions after you read it, come find me on Twitter or on my blog, and I'm happy to discuss sort of the more geeky stuff. But it is quite geeky. If you know finance, though, it should be fairly simple. I mean, you'll know the models, but if you're just interested in finance and economics, but you haven't had any sort of formal training, I understand it will look quite geeky. Anyway, moving on, I do think that in Europe, and especially in the UK, sort of one of the key economic and sort of wider societal stories at the moment is the virus, and more specifically this idea of a second wave. Now, I want to be very, very specific about what I mean when I say second wave, because when you talk about a second wave at the moment, what you hear is often you get a lot of pushback and say, no, we don't have a second wave. The second wave is completely different than the first wave, which is absolutely true, and I'll try to explain why I think that is the case and what the difference is. But just to be very, very clear, right? The second wave denotes the simple fact that the virus came, we locked down, then we tried to normalize, and now we're in a situation where the virus now seems to be developing in ways that we have to lock down again. Now, a full lockdown, very unlikely, but we're now clearly in a situation where European governments, and especially where I am, the UK governments, are now taking steps to rein in, again, the virus via restrictions on economic activity, if you want to put it in an economic sense. So, in order to understand, I think, what's going on, I think we have to distinguish between two very, very different ways that the virus is affecting the economy, at least insofar as goes the degree of economic activity. When the virus first hit, there was a genuine fear that we could end up with hundreds of thousands of dead, and as a result, a more or less complete shutdown of social order. Not because we locked down, but because of the virus itself, right? And I think that was the fact that fear was real, this idea that, if you call the police, nobody's going to come and help you because all the police officers are sick. If you call the firefighters, it's going to be the same. If you have a heart attack, tough shit, because, either the paramedics are ill or they're too busy ferrying COVID patients to the hospital, and in any case there won't be any ICU beds, that type of thing. And we were in that situation, and even if we can say now with hindsight that that didn't happen in a lot of places, it did happen in northern Italy, it did happen in a place like New York, and actually it was close to happening other places as well. Spain had it really tough as well, and so the fact that we were staring down that barrel, I think, made complete lockdowns impossible to avoid. I think that's really important, because I think history will have a tendency to judge reactions such as the ones we've just had quite harshly, because history will have a tendency to say something like, well, that was a massive overreaction, right? With a massive overreaction, because there's no need to react like that. But that's because history has the benefit of the adaptive behavior that we will we will have to a virus such as this, right? Which then brings us into the second wave where we are now, right? Where I think we can say, I mean, look, there's no certainty here, but if you look at the death numbers and the virus numbers, the link between the two have been broken, which is not completely which is not completely unsurprising. The people that are most susceptible to the virus, they got it in the sort of quote unquote first wave, and a lot of them have also already died. So in some sense, the fact that there's now healthier people that are getting the virus, and which healthier people are getting the virus, which means that in the binary outcome, whether you live or die, they live. Now, I say this because we know now that there are long-term effects from the virus as well that are, detrimental to your health, but they don't really matter for this discussion, I would say, in the terms of the statistics. What they do matter for, though, is the rate at which we have to discount the virus. So I think you could say that if you are, it's difficult at this point, I would say, to put a number on how worried we have to be about the virus as a whole because of the sort of, I'm going to use a term that Bret Weinstein uses in terms of the downstream effect of that. Yeah, but we if you're talking economic terms, we discount the future imperfectly, right? So it's always difficult to know exactly how much weight we have to put on something like that. But what I will say for sure is that on a binary outcome, living or dying, virus cases are screaming higher, but we don't have as many deaths as a result. The ICU beds are not getting filled up, at least not yet, and therefore we're in a different situation now. Which again, I think I want to be very clear about this. That means that the reaction we're currently having to the virus, insofar as it restrains our ability to engage in economic activity, is mainly behavioral. The main link here goes from government action to behaviors of households and businesses, right? So governments clearly are scared, because if governments weren't scared, the governments could go something like, this is the second wave, we have to keep on, the economy is more important than locking down a second time. But clearly now the virus has been progressing pretty much since the beginning of August, and it's progressing. And so at least in Europe, governments are now having to try to rein it back in via restrictions on social activity and economic activity. In that context, of course, I would say that the behavior of households and businesses become important, because it doesn't matter whether I have an argument to say, maybe the virus isn't as dangerous as it was, maybe it's mutated to a less virulent version, or you can imagine all kinds of arguments on the sort of scientific health side to say, well, actually, maybe the virus is not as dangerous as it was. But if people behave as if it is, doesn't matter. And I think what we're seeing now is that the second sort of wave, if you will, has now been so sustained for such a long time in Europe that we're now starting to really change our behavior again in terms of how we react to the virus. And therefore, as an economist, all I can say is that's good. There will be a real economic effect from this, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're sitting there going, why are we worrying about this virus? It's not dangerous. Well, I don't know. We can have an argument about that. That's separate, but it will have an economic effect because people will react to it, and governments will now react to it for a second time. And so the only cure for this, if you want to stay in that kind of frame of mind, is time. At least insofar as goes that I would say that a vaccine is probably still quite a long way off, at least in sort of a mass vaccine program. And therefore, what we can say with certainty in terms of the good news is that we will become better at adapting to the virus, or more specifically, the risk-reward calculation in terms of engaging in economic activity at the same time as the virus is still here will change, because again, a new virus today becomes an old virus tomorrow, and that risk becomes embedded in the way we understand uncertainty, and therefore we will learn to cope with it better. I think that's just that, at least from an economic perspective, that's the way I would analyze our response to it. Whether that's the correct response is a different, I would say correct from a scientific, sort of health scientific perspective, that's a very, very different discussion than I would say what the economic development is. And this goes back to the point what I said about history, is that history written in 10 years time will look at this with the benefit of an iterated process by which we've become much better at adapting to whatever the coronavirus is, right? So in 10 years' time, even if you don't have a vaccine, I guarantee you we will be going to restaurants because we will have come up with a system of some kind, or have learned to live with it, with the risk of getting coronavirus, that we will be going to restaurants. I have very little doubt about that. So I think having that perspective and trying to analyze the current situation within that perspective, I think is quite important, especially, at least for me as an economist who's trying to explain what's going on, because the idea that the virus is the second wave is now sort of quote unquote worse than the first wave because there are more people getting sick, that's not really the way. I think that is that's not really the way to look at it. And the final point I'd say is that if you take the two things that could kind of break the link between, right now, I would say, between the virus existing and then us basically going back to normal, or us breathing a sigh of relief, would be, well, one obviously is a vaccine. And it wouldn't just have to be any vaccine, it would have to be a vaccine that is efficient and one that can be deployed relatively rapidly. Then obviously that would be a huge, if from a market perspective or from an economic perspective, you can imagine if that headline kind of hits, that would be sort of a huge regime change. But I'm not very optimistic about that, in the sense that I think that the best we can hope for now is to realize the virus is here, and we're going to have then a sort of an annual rolling vaccine program, a little bit like the flu, and it'll some years we will have a bad coronavirus epidemic or a less effective vaccine, and then the next year will be better. But it's going to be sort of one of those things that is just unfortunately going to be there. At least this is my understanding of it. That might be wrong. I'm not in any way an expert of this, but this is kind of like the way I'm thinking about it at the moment. And the second aspect, which actually, if you want to levy criticisms at governments or in general at authorities, it's here, is that if we had a very efficient testing system, we could, in principle, be engaged much more freely in the kind of economic activity that we are currently sort of not able to engage in. Because imagine I was going out with some friends tomorrow, 20 friends, we're going out for dinner, having some beers, and at the moment, you can't do that because if one is infected, oh my god. But if we could go out today, get a test, get a reply within two hours, yes, no, or maybe a little bit like the pregnancy test or something like that. You get 2 strikes, you have it, 1 you don't, something like that. If that was possible, or if we had a testing machine that was just a little bit quicker than it is now, well, maybe you could give yourself access to kind of having these kinds of engaging these kind of activity. But at the moment, for example, in the UK where I am now, oh my god, there's no way. The testing machine is in tatters, and so that's just not possible. It's just not possible to have that kind of security. I haven't personally had a test since this began, and for example in Denmark, where I'm from, my parents have had like 5 tests, and they've all been negative, thank God. But they've just come visited me, for example. They went back, had a test, got the result negative. So so that distinction I think is huge, because if you have a testing system like that, you can engage in activity, have a test before you engage in activity, have a test after you've engaged in activity, and then you can assess the risk as you go along, or assess the profile. But if you can't have tests, you can't do it. And at the moment in the UK, that's the reality. So vaccine test, it doesn't seem like any of those two sort of silver bullets are going to help us at the moment. So therefore, I think the virus is going to be there. But over time, we will get better at adapting to it. But we will get better partly because our risk assessment will change, right? Like again, like a new risk that pops up today, we will be much more afraid of that risk or that kind of event relative to that event iterating itself, and then in period 10, we will have learned to adapt to it much better. So I think that we're going through that process at the moment, but it's going to take quite a long time. Anyway, I'll move on now to another topic I wanted to talk about, which is really sort of like I wouldn't say philosophical, but this idea that where can we go and have good discussions? Because at the moment, the kind of discussions we're having about a lot of things, you could talk about the race, the Black Lives Matter, which is where where a lot of the flurry have been recent, but just in general, the mainstream debate, the debate that tends to go on a lot on social media, the debate that tends to go on a lot I would say in the mainstream media and on social media, it's just a degenerative debate. I think there's a lot of tribalism. Identity politics is another way to talk about it, and it's a disease, I would say, which is spreading a little bit too rapidly for comfort at the moment, and it's spreading along a lot of axis, a lot of perspective. There are clearly a lot of people that are afraid of saying what they feel like, and if they say what they feel like, they can get cancelled, and we've had a lot of examples of this. And the thing is, I don't really know what to call it, except that, you have something is going on, and it's mainly on the left, although you have tendencies on the right as well in terms of this. On the left, you have these kind of, you call it wokeism. You have wokeism on the right as well. I guarantee you, especially some of the Brexit debate on the right is nuts in my view. But it's mainly on the left, and the best examples I can give you in terms of what's going on within the heads of sort of a lot of people is to just use myself an example. I'm pretty much a centrist, like center right in Denmark, which makes me center left, and fucking like hugely left liberal in the US. But like someone like me in the last 12 to 18 months, we are being pushed way to the right, because on the left you can't have a debate anymore, because if you don't have the right opinions, you're just being cancelled. In any case, I'm a white Northern European man. I mean, oh my god, that's just in itself, excludes me from having anything to say. I mean, my only job is to bow my head and pay reparation for my color and pay reparation for my gender, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, of course. This is not the way it always is, but you do have an element of that, which is odd, right? Which is just odd. So I think a lot of people like me, you just try not to engage with it, because it's just like you just can't. And so the question that becomes, as I said in the beginning, where's the good discussion? And so what I will try to do sort of in the next sort of 5 to 6 minutes, I'll try to give you an examples of where to go. So I'll put up some links in the YouTube. But just to recap what the rules are for having a good conversation, because sometimes I think that we forget that, and if we try to follow those rules on social media and when we have discussions in general with people we don't know, we would just be in such a much better place. So, I mean, I think generosity, tolerance, forgiveness, right? If you have those three things, you can have a good discussion with someone on the other side, because you are able to see that other person's viewpoint. If that other person makes a mistake, you can use that instead of just being. I think Douglas Murray, which I'll talk about in a minute, he said something very, very nicely in some of his hallucinations. He says you have to be magnanimous in victory, right? Which is exactly right. Like if I have an argument and I manage to persuade the other person about that I'm right, then I should be magnanimous and say, okay, that's good, we can argue, and maybe that person will probably teach me something about some other stuff as well. So I think that kind of thing is very important. I would even say, I've said that before, love, even compassion, you have to have some kind of love is it's a very strong word in this, but you have to have some kind of affinity for the person you're talking to. And at the moment there's a lot of debate going on, a lot of discussions going on, where actually there's hatred and disdain between identity and groups, and that's obviously not helpful. I think you have to be humble, show humility. That's a very, very good characteristic often to show. That's a very, very good way to engage with people, especially on topics that can be difficult, where there's no clear answer. If you engage with that kind of context, and humble and humility, I think that's quite attractive. It invites people in instead of pushing them away. And then, of course, I think, just if you want to go to the hardcore facts, you need a strong way of sorting shit from fact from fiction, right? And at the moment, we just seem like in the context of some discussions, we just can't. Like I mentioned it in when I last talked about this in the context of right after George Floyd had been killed, and there's a lot of flurry with the Black Lives Matter in the context of the Sam Harris podcast. Bret Weinstein did some as well, where I said, again, it's just an outpouring as well. People had an outpouring at the time Sam Harris had one where he did fantastic on a podcast, and I tried to convey the same idea, saying like, look. I mean, if we can't even agree on sort of this simple, like whether this paper is white or black, I mean, then we're doomed. We can't have any kind of discussion, and sometimes the debate just degenerates. So where can we regenerate it? Well, I already mentioned one name, Douglas Murray. I think Douglas Murray, he's one of the people who writes and speaks most eloquently about this. The Madness of the Crowds, which is a book he wrote. Did he write it a couple of years ago? It came out, or a year ago. I listened to it on Audible. He reads it himself. I mean, it cuts through the zeitgeist as like a warm knife through butter. I mean, it's fantastic. He goes through race, gender, trans, gay, and he discusses the identity politics that's going on within these kinds of frameworks, and he does it extremely well. He just wrote a new version of this book, which basically, I think he added a chapter about what's going on at the moment, Black Lives Matter, sort of that type of stuff, a little bit of COVID, probably, and you can't get it anywhere. People are I think Amazon's run out or something. I don't know, but anyway. Because he just put out a new book, he's done a lot of appearances on different podcasts. He just did Joe Rogan, for example. You should go. I'll put a link up on that. You should go and listen to that. But in any case, Douglas Murray is detox for your mind, I think. And I'm saying this knowing full well that a lot of people see Douglas Murray, they hear his name, they say, "Oh yeah, he's just a fascist and a racist." And if you listen to him, you must be a fascist and a racist. And I just sometimes you have to state these kinds of things up front and just call them bullshit. I mean, no, they're not. And I think those of us who actually like what he says, instead of just clicking like on his tweets on Twitter, which I know sometimes that's what I do, and we have to be brave. We have to stand up and say, look, I like what he says about this. I don't like what he says about that. For example, in my case, when it comes to Europe, he wrote a book called The Strange Death of Europe, and when it comes to Brexit, I think I would have a lot of disagreements with Douglas Murray, but that doesn't matter. I feel like he's a person that I could sit down and have a conversation with, and I would walk away enlightened, right? That's it. I'm 100% sure. On 1 hour conversation, Douglas Murray and me, a couple of beers maybe, I don't know what he drinks, maybe coffee, whatever, tea, fantastic. I would walk away, and hopefully I would be able to give him some ideas as well, but we would be able to walk away smiling, shake hands, and it would have been a good day because we'd had a conversation where we'd felt like we started here and we ended here instead of starting here and then ending up tearing each other to bits, right? Those kinds of conversations, I think at the moment, are very important. They are taking place, and where they're taking place, I think we have to show it, and we have to be brave enough to say, this is the kind of conversation we want to have. And if the persons that are having those kinds of conversations are in the eye of the mainstream seen as or caricaturized like monsters, we have to be brave enough. We must be brave enough to stand up for them, right? And Douglas Murray, he is one of those persons. Another, obviously, and I recommend them every time. Bret Weinstein and his wife Heather Hine in their Dark Horse podcast. It's a tour de force. And those, they are as well often, I would say, they have been as well, I would say, I don't know whether, I mean, you can't call them Nazis and fascists and things like that. I mean, I doubt anyone would call them that, but they are also often, I would say, subject to critique just because people have preconceived notions about them. And but in any case, I mean, I can't really see why that would be a problem for them now, because they must have washed away all critique levied against them with what they're doing with the Dark Horse podcast. Just to recap, they're now on the 47th. As I record this, they're now on the 47th podcast plus Q&A. They started talking about the virus now. Then the Black Lives Matter protest started. Now they're talking about that. Most recently, they live in Portland, Oregon, so they've been coughing their way through life recently because the fires. They talked a little bit about that. But in any case, look, they just talk about the world in a way which makes sense. They talk about the world in a way which lifts your mind up instead of drags it down. And they talk about it from a perspective of confidence and from a perspective also, like I said, humility. For example, I mean, if they don't know anything, if they don't know something, they will tell you. They will go and investigate. They'll come back in the next podcast and they'll give you an opinion. They're, by the way, evolutionary biologists, so obviously that informs their view of the world, which again is a great place to be, you know, because, you know, who doesn't want to learn about evolution, biology, and stuff like that? That's quite, I think, useful in the current environment, so that's great as well. No, so you should go listen to them. I'm a patron of theirs as well. You know, maybe you should be as well. I think really, you know, they deserve our full support. And again, listening to 90 minutes of them having a conversation with each other about life and, you know, current events. I mean, oh my God. I mean, that is just. You do that and you walk away a better person compared to watching 90 minutes of CNN, at which point you'll just want to, you know, crawl into a corner and cry. So, you know, again, we need to highlight the good discussions. That's the good discussions. Finally, there are two other individuals here I'd like to mention, which have kind of, I think it's fair to say, it's fair and unfair at the same time, but it's fair to say that they have kind of risen to the fore in the context of the Black Lives Matter flurry, because they are black, but to just reduce them to interlocutors in the discussion on this because they're black is unfair. But still, I think the reason why they've kind of now sticking their heads way above everyone else is because of this. I'm talking about John McWhorter, who is a linguist at Columbia University, and Glenn Loury, who is a professor of economics at Brown University. They are what I would say, you know, you could call them, they are black American intellectuals, right? And they have been engaged in the public debate, I would say, for a long time, but most recently, in particular, I think in response to some of the interactions they've had with the Dark Horse podcast and Bret Weinstein, they've really, I think, bust onto the scene, and they're fantastic. They provide a very cogent, level-headed, and effectively, I would say, accurate description of the Black Lives Matter or the sort of the discussion within the U.S. Between sort of race. And maybe accurate is the wrong word, because that denotes that I assume that what they're saying is 100% right and there's no other precision. Obviously that's not the case, but they're discussing, I think, the reality of this discussion in a US context, which makes a lot of sense. Now, if you wanted to sort of criticize them from a point of view of this particular debate, what you can say is that they have a very specific, I would say, as far as when I listen to them, they have a very specific argument, and that specific argument goes something along the lines of, well, actually, you know, black people in the US should get that chip off the shoulder a little bit, because there's only one way that they move ahead. That's by their own force, right? So there's a little bit this idea that the Black Lives Matter has the movement, especially the most recent iteration, has kicked up a lot of this old sort of reflexive ideas that the white people just owes black people a lot, and then now it's time for just black people to sit down and receive what they're owed. I'd say fair to say Glenn Loury and John McWhorter says that's not no, that's not how it works. And I think that the way they do it is that the way they argue, the way they've entered this debate is very good. Again, like I said, when I come back to this idea that go and listen to some of the podcasts. They've also done some dual podcasts actually on Blogging Heads TV. You'll see that on YouTube. That conversation, and they don't agree on everything. By the way, they have like vicious arguments sometimes where they're very polite, obviously, but sometimes you feel like, oh my god, they'll be at each other if they're in front of each other. But they I think they bust into the scene here, and I hope they stay because they are fantastic, especially in the U.S. context. I think they are, in terms of explaining what's going on in an American context, they are really good. So go check that out. I'll put up links here. And so that was, I've done Douglas Murray, I've done the Dark Horse, I've done Glenn Loury and John McWhorter. Yeah, that was the woke. I mean, listen to all these people, and you will cleanse the wokeism from your system. It's great. It's great. Listen to them, not Fox News and CNN, and you'll be a better person. Finally, on the finance and economic side, I think actually, because it's been a while since I talked about sort of the kind of sort of monetary policy, fiscal policy regime. I've done a lot of writing on this, and I still think it stands to the test of time. But actually, if you want a good update of what kind of regime we're in the economy and finance, you should go to Joe Weisenthal's and Tracy Alloway's podcast Odd Lots and listen to the 2 back-to-back podcasts with Neil Kashkari, who's the Fed president of Minneapolis, and Paul Macaulay, who's the formerly MD at PIMCO. You should listen to the Neil Kashkari first, and then the Paul Macaulay afterwards. They were done right after each other. And those two basically just describe the regime we're in. And it's funny is because I was like lobbing, my metaphorical, tennis ball at the microphone when I was listening, because I was like, bullshit. I mean, I really sort of think that the kind of world that they describe, there's a lot of sort of things that don't make sense. They leave out a lot of logical issues, which I've, by the way, tried to explain in a separate essay on fiscal policy. But I have to say, the way they describe the world is pretty much the way that policymakers and financial markets are reacting and responding and acting as if we are in that kind of world at the moment. So, for that reason alone, I think you should definitely go and have a listen to that. And, Tracy and Joe, they're always a good punters in the podcast world. I think they do great interviews, so I definitely try to listen to most of what they do. Finally, on this the business investment policy podcast BIP, it's a bit of a dark horse. Well, maybe no, in this kind of context, maybe that's not the right way to describe them. But it's a new podcast, but I think they produce consistent content. It's Australian. There's a couple of Australian blokes, but they talk about global financial markets, and I think actually the kind of guests they have on and the way they conduct themselves is pretty good. So make space for that on your list, because I know that you have a long list, and I know that you don't have time to listen to everything, and that's the reality of the thing of the way it is. But make space for that. And I think I will leave it here. I'm at 37 minutes. I had promised myself only to go to 35, so now I'm 2 minutes past. So I will finish now, because you don't have time. You don't have all the time in the world to listen to me blabbering. If you want to come find me, Twitter is the best place to get a hold of me, but also send me an email. Come through my website. Always happy to have a conversation, and hopefully what I can do with some of these videos is I can point you to where the good discussion takes place, and then you can avoid all the shit that's going on. And if you do that, like one step at a time, we can move forward instead of in a hole. Let's hope I'm not being too optimistic on that one. In any case, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for reading my blog as well. Like I said, new piece coming up tonight, which will be tomorrow, which will be the night before when a lot of people look at this, but have a look at it. In any case, thank you. That's all for me today. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.